The volunteer looked at her list twice before she looked at him, not once, twice, as though the second look might produce a different result than the first, or as though looking at the list rather than at him was the more comfortable of the two available directions. The man standing at the check-in table of the Meridian Culinary Institute's annual gala was wearing a dark burgundy jacket over a black shirt, dark trousers, and shoes that were polished and unremarkable. He was 44 years old with a quiet, unhurried quality that came not from slowness, but from the specific comfort of a man who had nothing to prove and knew it. He was holding the hand of his 10-year-old daughter, Amara, who was wearing a deep green dress she had chosen herself and who was currently looking, not at the volunteer or the list or the entrance to the gala, but at the architectural details of the Meridian Institute's entrance hall, which were considerable, and which she had apparently decided deserved her full attention. The Institute was housed in a building that had been a civic hall in an earlier life, and the entrance hall retained the bones of that earlier purpose in its high ceilings and the elaborate plaster work along the upper walls, and the quality of the light that fell through the clear-story windows above. Amara was looking at the plaster work. She was looking at it the way she looked at things she intended to draw later, with the systematic attention of someone memorizing what she needed rather than simply seeing it. His name was Victor Asante. He had founded the Asante Culinary Foundation 14 years ago for reasons that had to do with his mother and with a kitchen in Accra and with a conversation he had never quite been able to leave behind. A conversation about what it meant to cook for people and what happened to that, meaning when the people who could cook for people most beautifully were prevented from developing the skill by the simple and brutal fact of what it cost to be taught. His mother had been a cook, not a chef in the titled sense, not a person whose name appeared on menus or in reviews, but a cook in the deepest sense of the word, someone who understood food as a form of love, expressed through precision and patience and the specific knowledge of what a person needed from a meal at a specific moment. She had cooked for 40 years in homes and small restaurants and at events, and she had known more about food than most people who were paid many times what she was paid to know it, and she had never once been given the conditions that would have allowed that knowledge to become something recognized and built upon. Victor had spent 20 years in food distribution and supply chain management, had built a company that supplied produce to restaurants across 3 regions, and had used the proceeds of that company, once it reached a scale that allowed it to establish the foundation, whose single purpose was to fund scholarship places at culinary schools for students who could not otherwise afford to attend. The Meridian Culinary Institute was the Foundation's flagship partnership. It was the most respected culinary institution in the region, with a rigorous program and a placement record that meant its graduates were sought before they graduated. It was also, without the Foundation's endowment, accessible to a very narrow range of students. Because the fees were what the fees were and the institutional aid was what it was, and the gap between the two was where most talented students from ordinary backgrounds fell through. The Foundation had been filling that gap for 11 years. Every scholarship student currently at the Meridian Institute was there because of money that had come from Victor's foundation. There were at present 22 of them. Tonight's gala was the annual celebration of the scholarship program. The scholarship students cooked the dinner. The guests were the Institute's faculty, its board, its donors, and its alumni. And the evening was organized around the specific intention of showing what the scholarship students could do when given the conditions to do it properly. Victor had been to every gala. He had attended the first one with his mother, who had been 67 and had eaten everything on the menu with the focused pleasure of someone for whom food was a serious matter, and who was taking the scholarship students' work seriously. She had died 2 years later. He had been to every gala since. He had not registered formally for tonight because he never registered formally. He communicated through the foundation office, which communicated with the Institute's events team, and somewhere in that chain the communication had produced a gap where his name should have appeared on the volunteers list. The volunteer's name was Grace. She was in her early 20s, A culinary student in her second year, pulled in to help with event logistics because the institute asked students to support the gala as part of their professional development curriculum. She was conscientious and organized, and she had looked at her list twice and not found the name she was looking for, and was now in the specific position of someone who wanted to be helpful, and whose tools were not giving her what she needed. She said, "I'm not finding your name on the confirmed guest list. Do you have a ticket confirmation or an email from the events office?" Victor said, "I don't have one with me. My name is Victor Asante. I'm the founder of the Asante Culinary Foundation. Grace looked at this information with the expression of someone recognizing that a name carries a specific weight in a specific context, and that the weight and the context were both larger than the tools she had available. For managing them, she said, "I know the foundation's name. I'm on a foundation scholarship." She said it with the direct simplicity of someone stating a fact that was relevant. "But our protocol requires a confirmed listing for gala entry, and I don't see one." She looked genuinely uncomfortable with the gap between the protocol and the situation. "I need to call someone. Is that okay?" Victor said, "Of course." She made the call. She was efficient and clear, and she communicated the situation accurately and without embellishment. She listened. She said 3 words and ended the call. She said, "Someone from the events team is coming. 2 minutes." She looked at Victor with the expression of someone who wanted to say something else. She said, "I want you to know this isn't what I would choose to be doing right now. I mean, stopping you here?" She said it with the directness of someone who had decided that the honest statement was better than the managed one. Victor looked at her. He said, "I know. You're doing your job correctly with the information you have," she said. "The information I have is incomplete," he said. "Yes, that's not your failure." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Go ahead." She said, "The foundation scholarship. I've been on it for 14 months. I've never met anyone from the foundation. I didn't know what the founder looked like." She paused. "I should have known," Victor said. "Why?" She said, "Because I'm here because of your foundation. I'm cooking tonight because of your foundation. I've been trained by people who can teach me because your foundation paid for me to be in a room with them." She looked at him directly. "I should know what you look like," Victor said. "I've never put my name on the materials." "The foundation doesn't use my image," she said. "Why not?" He thought about how to answer that in the way that was true. He said, "Because the point is the students, not who funded them. If my face is on the materials, the story becomes about me. The story should be about the students." Grace looked at this from the angle of someone who was both a student and a person who had just been stopped at a door. She said, "But you got stopped at the door." He said, "Yes." She said, "Because no one knew your face." He said, "Yes." She said, "There's a cost to that." He said, "There is." She said, "Is it worth it?" Victor looked at the culinary student on a foundation scholarship who was standing at a check-in table at a gala she was helping to run. Having stopped at the door, the man who had made it possible for her to be here, and asking him with the direct, honest curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to know, he said, "Ask me again in 40 years. She almost smiled. She said, "I'll remember that." The events coordinator arrived 90 seconds later. Her name was Sandra, and she was in her mid-40s, and she moved with the compressed efficiency of someone managing the logistics of a large event and who had just been handed a situation that required a different register than logistics. She came to the check-in table and saw Victor, and her expression did the specific thing that expressions did when a person encountered information that restructured their understanding of the previous 10 minutes. She said, "Mr. Asante, I'm so sorry," he said. "Sandra." She said, "There was a gap in the coordination between your foundation office and our events team. Your confirmation wasn't transferred to the gala list." She said it directly without decoration. "I take responsibility for that." He said, "Is it fixable tonight?" She said, "It's already fixed." She stepped back from the table. "Please come in." She looked at Amara. "And you must be Amara. The scholarship students have been told you might be here." 3 of them specifically asked. Amara looked at her with the assessment she applied to new adults. She said, "They know me?" Sandra said, "They know of you. Your father talks about you when he visits the institute." Amara looked at her father with the expression of a child discovering that a parent has been representing them in spaces they didn't know about. She said, "What do you say?" Victor said. "That you ask better questions than most of the people in whatever room I'm in." Amara considered this. She said, "That's accurate." She looked at Sandra. "I have a question," Sandra said. "Go ahead," Amara said. "The students who are cooking tonight, how long have they been practicing this specific menu?" Sandra said, 3 weeks. Amara said, "Do they know who they're cooking for tonight? The specific guests?" Sandra said they know the gala guest list in general terms. "They know your father will be here," Amara said. "Does that change how they cook?" Sandra considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She said, "I think it makes them want to do their best work. Knowing someone specific is going to eat it," Amara said. "That's interesting. Cooking for a specific person versus cooking for guests in general." She pulled a small notebook from the pocket of her green dress, a notebook she apparently carried everywhere, and wrote something. She said, "I'll think about that." They went in. The Meridian Institute's main hall had been transformed for the evening. With the specific transformation that happened when Culinary, students were given the task of creating an environment as well as a meal. The tables were set with the precision of people who had been taught that the visual presentation of a table was part of the meal's hospitality, not separate from it. The flowers were low enough to allow conversation across them. The lighting was warm and directional, the kind that made food look like itself rather than like something better or worse than it was. The whole room communicated that something serious was happening here and that it was taking itself seriously without being solemn about it. Amara walked into the room and stopped and looked at it the way she had looked at the entrance hall's plasterwork, with the systematic attention of someone building a memory of something worth keeping. She said, "They did the room too." Victor said, "Part of the curriculum." She said, "The whole thing, not just the food." He said, "Hospitality is the whole thing, not just the plate." She wrote something in her notebook. They were shown to their table by a student named Marcus, who was in his 3rd year and who walked them through the room, with the composed warmth of someone who had been taught that the quality of the welcome was the first course. He introduced himself and told them what the evening's menu would be, and explained that the scholarship students had each contributed 2 dishes and that the sequence had been designed collaboratively. Amara said, "You designed the sequence together?" Marcus said, "Yes. We spent 2 days on the order of dishes. It took a long time because everyone had opinions." Amara said, "What was the disagreement?" Marcus said, "Whether to open with something bold or something subtle. Half of us thought you should give the guests something that announced the evening immediately. The other half thought you should draw them in slowly and build." Amara said, "Which side won?" Marcus said, "We did a test dinner. 2 versions of the sequence. Then we asked 5 people who hadn't been involved which version felt better." Amara said, "And?" Marcus said, "The subtle opening won." "By 4 to 1, Amara said. "What did you learn from that?" Marcus looked at her. He said that the instinct to announce yourself is usually about the person announcing, not about the audience. Amara wrote this in her notebook. She wrote it immediately before she said anything else. The way she wrote things she was afraid of, losing. Victor watched his daughter write down something a culinary student had said about the instinct to announce yourself, and felt the specific quality of an evening that was working on multiple levels simultaneously. He thought about the check-in table, about Grace saying there's a cost to that, with the direct, honest curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand rather than challenge. He thought about his answer, "Ask me again in 40 years, which was the honest answer because he did not yet know whether the cost was worth it in the full accounting, only that the principle behind the cost was right, and that right principles sometimes had costs that were worth paying, and sometimes had costs that were not, and that the only way to know the difference was time. Had been paying this particular cost for 14 years. He had kept his face off the materials and his name out of the narrative, and had watched the scholarship students become the story, which was what he had wanted. He had attended every gala and sat in rooms where extraordinary young people cooked food that would have made his mother stop eating and pay attention, and he had not made that experience into something that was about him, and he believed that was the right choice. And tonight he was sitting at a table in a room. those young people had set up, and the gala had nearly been the evening where the cost became visible, nearly, because Grace had called someone, and Sandra had come, and the gap had been closed. Before the evening lost what it was supposed to be, he thought about what he was going to do about the gap. Not just the administrative gap, the coordination failure between his foundation office and the Institute's events team. The structural gap. The fact that he had kept his face off the materials for 14 years, and the consequence of that was that a scholarship student on a foundation scholarship had not known what he looked like, which meant she had not known who was standing at the table she was managing. He had kept his face off the materials because the point was the students. He still believed that. But there was a version of the approach that served the students, and a version that created situations like tonight. And the difference between them was probably not about whether his face was on the materials, but about whether the people who managed access to foundation events had sufficient information to recognize him. That was a narrower change than putting his face on everything. And it was the right change. He would call his executive assistant tomorrow and make it. The first course arrived. It was a cold dish, as the subtle opening dictated, a cured fish preparation with citrus and herbs that arrived with the visual precision of something that had been thought about carefully and executed with full attention. Amara looked at it for a moment before she ate it. The way she looked at things she was going to form an opinion about. She ate a small amount. She looked at her father. She said, "The citrus is doing something specific." He said, "What is it doing?" She said, "It's making the fish taste more like itself, not covering it, amplifying it." She ate a little more. "That's hard to do. Most acid just cuts. This one lifts." Victor tasted his own. He said, "You're right," she said. "Who made this one?" He said, "I don't know yet. We'll find out at the end of the evening." The students present the dishes and introduce themselves after the last course. Amara said, "I want to tell whoever made this that the citrus is the best decision in the dish." Victor said, "You can tell them." She said, "I'll also ask them how long it took them to figure out that citrus could lift instead of cut, because that's not something you learn quickly." He said, "You can ask them that too." She wrote something in her notebook. She was building course by course and conversation by conversation, a set of questions for the post-dinner presentation that were going to be more specific and more interesting than most of the questions in the room. The evening moved through its courses with the rhythm of a meal that had been designed rather than assembled. Each course was different from the one before it in a way that felt intentional rather than arbitrary, a sequence of decisions rather than a sequence of dishes. Amara engaged with each one with the focused attention she brought to things worth engaging with, which was most things, and her notebook filled with observations and questions and the specific kind of annotation that was halfway between a recipe note and a philosophical reflection. Between the third and fourth courses, Grace came to the table. She came with the composed purpose of someone who had made a decision about something and was acting on it. She stopped beside Victor and said, "I wanted to come and say something properly." Victor said, "Sit for a minute." She sat. She said, "When I was accepted onto the foundation scholarship, I was told that the funding came from a private philanthropist who had established the program in honor of his mother, who was a cook." She looked at him. "That's you?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I've been thinking about your mother since you said that, about what it would have meant to her to know that someone built this because of her." Victor held her gaze. He said, "She knew. I told her before she died." Grace said, "What did she say?" He said, "She said she hoped the students would cook for people who needed feeding, not just people who could afford to eat well." Grace looked at this. She said, "That's what we try to do. The program has a community kitchen component. Third-year students cook one service a week at a community center 3 blocks from here." Victor said, "I know. I funded the kitchen equipment." Grace looked at him. She said, "You did?" He said, 2 years ago. The foundation made a capital grant. She said, "I've cooked in that kitchen." She stopped. "I've cooked in a kitchen you funded, on a scholarship you funded, in a program you established." She held his gaze. "And I stopped you at the door." He said, "You did your job correctly?" She said, "I know, but I want you to know that I understand what tonight cost. Even though it was only 2 minutes. She said it with the specific directness of someone who was being honest about something uncomfortable and had decided that the honesty was worth the discomfort. Victor looked at the 22-year-old culinary student who had stopped him at the door of his own gala and who was now sitting at his table and telling him she understood what it cost. He thought about his mother in Accra and about the kitchen in his memory and about 40 years of cooking that had never been given the conditions it deserved. He thought about what it meant to build something that addressed a structural gap and to keep your face off it for 14 years and to be stopped at the door of the thing you built by someone who was there because you built it. He said, "The 2 minutes are not the evening. The evening is the rest of this," Grace said. "Yes." He paused. "But the 2 minutes were real," he said. "They were real." She stood. She said, "The fourth course is one of mine. A braised preparation. It took me 9 attempts to get the timing right." He said, "I'll pay attention." She said, "Please do. And if it's not right, tell me." "I'd rather know," he said. "I will." She went back to her position. The fourth course arrived 10 minutes later. It was exactly right. The timing was what 9 attempts had made it, which was precise without being rigid, the braised element having the specific texture of something that had been given exactly the time it needed and no more. Amara ate it with the focused pleasure she brought to things that met the standard she had brought with her. She said, "This one knew when to stop." Victor said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Some braised things go too far. They're soft when they should have stayed firm enough to have something left to say." She ate a little more. This one stopped at the right moment. "There's still something in it." He said, "There's still something in it is a good way to describe it." She said, "Did the person who made it know that's what they were doing? Or did they figure it out by accident?" He said, "I think 9 attempts." She said, 9 attempts to find the right moment. She wrote it down. "That's a specific kind of patience." He said, "Yes." She said, "Most people stop before the 9th attempt." He said, "Most people." She said, "You don't." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because this program is 14 years old and you're still coming to the gala." Victor looked at his daughter across the table in the room the scholarship students had set and lit and filled with food that was the result of the specific kind of patience that stopped at the right moment and felt the feeling that had no efficient name, the feeling of a thing being what it had always been intended to be. He said, "Yes, I'm still coming." She said, "Good." She went back to the fourth course. She said after a moment, "I want to ask Grace how long it actually took to figure out the timing. Not 9 attempts, the actual hours." He said, "Ask her at the end of the evening." She said, "I will. She has good instincts." The citrus dish was hers too, wasn't it? He said, "I don't know yet." She said it was. The decision to lift instead of cut is the same instinct as knowing when to stop. They're the same kind of understanding. She wrote something. "I want to know if one person made both of those decisions tonight." The post-dinner presentation confirmed it. Grace had made the first and the fourth course. She stood at the front of the room with the other scholarship students and introduced her dishes with the composed clarity of someone who had thought carefully about what she made and why, and she said about the citrus preparation that she had been trying to figure out for 2 years. Why citrus made some things taste less like themselves, and she had eventually understood that the problem was quantity and angle, and that the right amount in the right place amplified rather than cut. And she said about the braised preparation, that she had made it 9 times and had stopped on the 9th because on the 9th, it still had something to say. Amara was writing in her notebook throughout. At the end of the presentation, there was a period for guests to speak with the students. Amara went directly to Grace. Victor watched from a distance. He watched his 10-year-old daughter and the 22-year-old scholarship student stand together and speak with the full attention of 2 people who had found in each other a shared language for something they both cared about deeply. He watched Amara ask questions, and Grace answer them, and Grace ask questions back, and Amara answer them with the directness she brought to things she actually knew. And he watched both of them write things in their respective notebooks and compare what they had written and the expression on both their faces that said, "This conversation is the thing I will remember from this evening." He stood at a respectful distance and watched and thought about his mother. He thought, about the kitchen in Accra and the conversation he had never been able to leave behind and the 40 years of cooking that deserved better conditions than it got. He thought about 14 years of foundation work and 22. Scholarship students and the citrus that lifted instead of cut and the braised thing that stopped when it still had something to say. He thought about Grace saying the 2 minutes were real. They were real. And they were also not the evening. And both of those things were true at the same time, which was the specific nature of most things worth sitting with. The evening ended. Students and guests moved toward the exit with the specific quality of a room that had done what it was built to do and was now letting people carry it away with them. Amara walked beside her father with her notebook under her arm, and the expression of someone who was still inside the evening and intended to stay there for a while. She said, "Grace is going to be a great chef," Victor said. "I think so too," she said. "She understands the why of things, not just the how."